Why hasn't the US struck an Iran yet? An armada has formed off the shores of Iran and is getting stronger by the day. And simultaneously, there have been talks in Oman and they are scheduled to continue. And obviously, they're probably not going to be negotiating about their regime survival. This means that if those talks are actually to be taken at face value, it would be a strategic and moral failure. The only reading of this situation, which gives the US the benefit of the doubt, is that it is merely a stalling operation to buy more time to build up the forces both within and without of Iran in order to pursue a successful regime change. This is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. My name is Shalom Bar Eretz. I'm a major in the IDF Reserves. I have degrees in sociology, political science, and international relations. And on this channel, we look behind the scenes to see the reasons why world events happen the way they do. One lens which I often look at when judging whether a state's actions is good or bad is to decide whether it is both strategically correct and morally correct. Sometimes there is a cause which you should morally undertake, but which is strategically untenable. Sometimes the moral thing is simply out of reach for any individual actor to do. Sadly, sometimes you have to pick your battles and save your resources for different projects. No state can be a moral crusader across the world and try to right every wrong. But then there are things which are strategically correct to do, but morally wrong. These are the things which at least I hope countries avoid. But history is full of examples of countries cutting deals with treacherous regimes, propping up dictatorships when it is strategic. Although often, I think long term, these turn out also to be strategic mistakes. Of course, the biggest failures would be when a state undertakes something which is both strategically and morally the bad thing to do. And sadly, off the top of my head, I can think of a few. And of course, the best choices are when they are both morally and strategically the correct thing to do. And when a situation like that arises, I find it hard to understand why a state wouldn't undertake it. Usually, however, it is because these things can also be the hard thing to do. Often, it is much easier to simply do nothing, rather than do the morally correct and strategically sound option. From my reading of the situation, getting rid of the Iranian regime is both the moral and the strategically correct thing for the US and its allies to undertake, especially at this juncture, because at this juncture, it will be the easiest that it has ever been. That is not to say it will be easy. It isn't. We will go into how difficult that can actually be. But all things being said, it is easier now than what it was a year ago and likely what it will be in the future. The reason why I say this is the moral thing to do should be clear to anyone who has been watching the news over the last month. We are talking about a regime who has been eliminating tens of thousands of protesters. There is almost no other example of this many protesters being eliminated by a ruling regime in human history. There is only perhaps the sole exception of Hama, which really isn't great company to keep. But even besides for this, the Iranian regime's long history of deplorable acts, both within the country and without the country, gives the clearest moral reasonings behind why that regime must go. This is to say nothing of the moral responsibility of the West to ensure that a regime of that sort will not get nuclear weapons. And no matter what sort of deal could be struck with that regime, history has shown that this would always be an option as long as they're there. And how would the US be able to explain away an Iranian nuclear attack against any number of Western targets in the future if it has had the ability to stop it now, when it also had the clear moral authority to do so? But of course, as mentioned before, the moral choice often isn't chosen because there can be other strategic calculuses which get in the way. But in the case of Iran, the strategic calculus is firmly in favor of removing the regime once and for all. This goes beyond their long history of supporting anti-Western groups around the world. This goes beyond their potential use of nuclear bomb if they ever would get one. This goes beyond their use of terrorist proxies. All of this is true, but if looked through the lens of American grand strategy, one must realize that the timing of the removal of Iran's regime dovetails nicely with U.S. strategy against a Chinese-led alliance. In a previous video, I went over the U.S. grand strategy in containing China in preparation for potential war and how removing Venezuela from the equation was a central aspect of that. While that front is not fully resolved, it seems the U.S. has definitely made their mark by removing Maduro, and it looks like, at the very least, Venezuela is off the game board for any potential war with China. Considering that the Chinese alliance also includes Russia and Iran, removing Venezuela has limited any potential conflict to the Eastern Hemisphere. It's not hard to understand that one of the U.S.'s main goals at the current moment is to limit the impact of this Chinese alliance in the future. One might even surmise that Trump's willingness to engage Russia might even be based on a far-fetched hope that Russia could be peeled away from that Chinese alliance. I personally don't think this is feasible. I don't think many would think this is feasible, but it is interesting to think about how that reading of events would explain much of Trump's negotiating positions over the last year. In any case, Iran has been driven further and further into that alliance with China, and leaving Iranian regime intact gives China a huge strategic boost for any upcoming war with America, as Iran could be counted on to, at the very least, sow chaos throughout the Middle East and Africa, which would necessarily mean the diversion of resources, either by America itself or its allies. As recent events have shown with the timescales of moving different carrier groups around the world, the ability for America to eliminate threats now in order to have all of their naval assets at hand for a single theater, the Chinese theater, in the event of a war, becomes crystal clear. By getting rid of the Iranian regime now, it would further simplify any war scenario with China, essentially reducing it from something that could be categorized as a world war into something much more limited, as it would only have one Indo-Pacific theater and not be spread out around the world, with, of course, the possibility of a European front if Russia is involved. This doesn't mean that if China were to lose most of its allies, it wouldn't try to cultivate new ones, but in terms of American grand strategy, getting rid of Iran would be a major win. That is why I say it is both the strategic thing to do and the moral thing to do. Of course, understanding that it is both the strategic and moral thing to do does not mean that that is what will be done. It also doesn't mean that that will be easy. If the U.S. decides that it needs to take out Iran, then they would obviously want to be in the best position possible for this to happen effectively. Externally, of course, we are watching a massive buildup of forces. Every passing day and week, more forces are being brought into the region. But I think the bigger question is what is happening internally. This is something where obviously I have to lean much more on speculation. But by looking at the considerations decision makers would be needing to make, we can understand what their goals should be. I released a previous video about how intervention needs to be focused on weakening the oppressive mechanisms of the Iranian regime and making space for internal groups to seize control. And I also made a short video saying how this is almost impossible as long as the regime maintains a monopoly on the use of force within the country. And as of yet, there haven't been defections from the Artesh, the Basij, or the IRGC. The logical extension of those two facts is that for any regime change to be successful, the opposition in Iran needs to be organized and armed. And this really is a precondition that needs to be met for regime change to be successful. It follows that this should be what the US and its allies are working towards before undertaking strikes. The ways they could go about this are multiple and varied. And it is important to note that almost every strategy has 4 historic failures for every historic success. So no one should think that this is easy to accomplish. But I do think that the amount of internal strife within Iran makes it prime for an organized resistance. But we also shouldn't paper over the different challenges that can happen, such as the opposition splintering, the creation of a power vacuum which can be filled with unsavory characters, separatists, militants, and the list goes on and on. I do believe that if these pitfalls are mapped out in advance, then alongside with simply arming groups to overthrow Iran, strategies can be formed to mitigate these pitfalls and to maximize the potential for an optimal outcome. This isn't to say this is easy to do, but as long as people go into it clear-eyed, there's at least the chance for an optimal outcome. This is not to say that regime change is ever simple. It never is. It opens the doors for a divergence of a plethora of unpredictable outcomes. Going in guns blazing without a plan and just hoping for the best is usually never a good idea. How you do something is sometimes as important as what you do. The US will rightly want to avoid getting into a long war where they have to prop up a new regime. So, taking some time to get all the parts into place before acting, if that is in fact what the US is doing, might be the correct thing to do. It is important to note that the cost of any operation needs to be balanced against the cost of inaction. And I think we have reached a point where the cost of inaction is exorbitantly high for the United States. If the Iranian regime can get away with the mass suppression of protesters in the way that it has done, even when it is at its weakest it's been in decades, when its economy is at its weakest, and being only half a year removed from military strikes which removed much of its defensive capabilities, while we simultaneously have every reason to take them out, then the threat of intervention will never hold any weight, either to Iran or any other authoritarian regime in the world in the future. If the US wouldn't remove Iran now and instead favor a deal which doesn't address most of the problems, then it would be safe bet to say the US never will. And this would naturally lead to an exponential increase in the deadly regime's use of power and other regimes like it around the world. So does all this mean that the US will in fact intervene? As I have laid out, it has every reason to intervene. But we should also never underestimate the seductive lure of non-action under the guise of peace. As much as some people may want peace, because everybody wants peace, oftentimes, in order to build a more just and better world, peace simply isn't an option. It is only a guise for letting evil triumph. Again, this is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. To support the channel, like, subscribe, follow me on X, and visit me on Patreon, where I also post free articles about topics which may not be the best for the YouTube algorithm. Until next time, take care.